Well, the Prime Minister has vowed to wreck the people-smuggling trade in her most daring policy announcements since seizing the top job a fortnight ago. In doing so, John Howard's Pacific solution has surely become Julia Gillard's East Timor solution. The East Timorese president says the federal government's plan lacks a lot of detail, and the federal opposition agrees, saying it doubts the government will ever send asylum seekers to East Timor for processing. Immigration Minister Chris Evans is in our Parliament House studio. To speak with him, our political editor Alison Carabine.
Chris Evans, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, Minister, opening a detention centre on East Timor is far from a done deal. If it falls through, what's your fallback option? Where else would you consider sending asylum seekers?
Well, what the Prime Minister announced yesterday was a proposal for a regional processing centre, not so much a detention centre.
And it's What's the difference?
Well, it's about the level of security required, etc. But what we're suggesting is that we need a regional approach. We need to take the rug from under the feet of people smugglers by saying there's no financial incentive, or there's no incentive, to come to Australia by boat. You can get your claim assessed fairly in anywhere in the region, so that there's no purpose in paying a people smuggler. And you'll be processed in the region, you'll be assessed according to your needs, and if you're found to be owed protection, you'll receive it. So it's about a regional solution, and one of the things we've got to do is find a location for a processing centre, but it's a much broader concept than just building a new detention centre.
But why East Timor in particular? Why are you convinced that East Timor will agree to host a processing centre? The reports coming out of Dili certainly suggest that some East Timorese people do not want their country used as a dumping ground for asylum seekers bound for Australia.
Well, one, it won't be a dumping ground, but two, you'd expect to have a lively debate in East Timor about any proposition. It's a democracy. It's one of the reasons why it has been considered, because it's a democracy and it's a signatory to the Refugees Convention. So it's certainly the starting point for a discussion, East Timor, but obviously it's about a regional solution, and there may well be other alternatives. But we've engaged with East Timor, we've engaged with New Zealand, and we'll be engaging with the other partners in the region.
But that engagement with East Timor does appear to be still in a very embryonic stage. Is it correct that Julia Gillard only contacted President Horta on Monday night, which does suggest this was a last-minute rush job?
No, look, well, to be fair to the Prime Minister, she's been Prime Minister for about a week and a half, so you'd expect anything she's done as an initiative would be in the last week and a half. The reality is that there's been an idea around about a regional framework for a while. We've been discussing among officials about that framework, and the Prime Minister seized on the idea of trying to promote that initiative, particularly in terms of a processing centre, and she's taken the initiative of talking to East Timor and talking to a few of the other countries in the region. But you can't keep this sort of thing secret, so she's come out, talked about it publicly as we try and advance it.
So you've announced it before working out any of the details. Is it because you feared that you couldn't keep it a secret? But doesn't the Australian public deserve to know a lot more about the detailed proposal before it is announced with such fanfare?
Well, it wasn't about fanfare. I thought the Prime Minister was very frank and honest with the Australian public yesterday about these issues, and highlighted there were no quick fixes, but that she was taking this initiative forward because she thought this was a way that we could start to deal with the issues in the region, and it's one I very strongly support. But you do have to start somewhere. You can't announce something and then say to other governments, oh, by the way, we've decided all the detail, here it is. That's not the way it works. We're going to have a negotiation, we're going to have discussions, but the broad framework's been outlined by the Prime Minister, and we're going to pursue it.
Couldn't this go in a similar way to how the mining tax proposal happened in this country? The government announced it before negotiating an outcome with stakeholders. That's what you're doing with this proposal for a processing centre on East Timor. You haven't done the legwork about an offshore processing centre. Could it fall apart like the original mining tax proposal did?
Well, there's a number of assumptions there that are just dead wrong and not based on any factual information at all. I mean, everyone wants to leap forward. The reality is we have been doing some work. We have had the Bali process. We have been working with our neighbours. We have been engaged with UNHCR about how we get a regional framework People movement in the region is not just our problem, it's a problem for Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore and everybody. We're not alone in dealing with this issue, particularly secondary movement of people who found a safe place in Southeast Asia. So what we're saying is those discussions have been taken to the next level. The Prime Minister suggesting this is the way to go forward, this is the way to try and make something of those discussions and work. But it's not as if that work hasn't been done. But have we negotiated detail with these other countries? No. And if it had been announced by way of a leak in a week's time, you would have said to me, why haven't you told the Australian public about this? You can't have it both ways. She's been honest, open and frank. The detail hasn't been finalised, but this is the way forward. This is what she's going to try and do to solve what is a serious public policy challenge.
Well, Chris Evans, why go to the trouble of and expense of building a processing centre on East Timor when we already have one on Nauru? Have you reconsidered opening the Nauru camp?
Well, one, Nauru's not a signatory to the Refugees Convention. Two, when Nauru was used, it was used as a dumping ground, and it was used to punish people, and it was used to con the Australian public that somehow these people would never come to Australia. And Tony Abbott again wants to con people by pretending he can tow boats back, pretending that somehow you can dump people at Nauru. All those people who went to Nauru actually ended up settling in Australia and New Zealand. This is not about denying our international obligations. This is about making them work. And the fundamental thing that drives people to seek to get on a leaky boat and put their lives at risk in getting to Australia is because they don't think they can get their claims fairly assessed in the rest of Southeast Asia. If you allow them to have their claims assessed fairly in Indonesia or Malaysia and they have hopes of resettlement, then they won't take the risk and they won't pay the people smuggler.
Now, you rightly point out that most people who were processed through Nauru were eventually resettled in Australia. Couldn't the same happen with East Timor, which means that it won't exactly work as a strong deterrence to other asylum hopefuls?
Well, there's no way we're walking away from our international obligations. One of the reasons we've engaged New Zealand is they provide good leadership in the region, but also because they're one of the other settlement countries. This is a global problem. Everyone sort of pretends it's only happening here. Well, it's not a given because people don't acknowledge that Italy, Britain, Canada are all dealing with this issue as well. And what we're saying is we're going to need a regional solution. We're not going to fix it on our own. And part of that is having work at source countries like Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, transit countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, and settlement countries like New Zealand and Australia.
But how effective as a deterrent will it be if the bulk of asylum seekers are eventually resettled in the country of their dreams, Australia?
Well, most asylum seekers just want safety. They're not necessarily dreaming about Australia. All the research indicates they're looking for safety. And be that Canada, America, New Zealand, Australia is not what their focus is. But we think there will be some deterrence value, but there'll certainly be strong deterrence about getting on a boat to Australia. If you get on a boat to Australia and you end up in a processing centre, be it in East Timor or anywhere else as a result, why would you do it? Why would you pay a people smuggler? Because your chances of being found to be a refugee are no better or worse.
And what would happen to Christmas Island, the detention centre on Christmas Island, if you do open the processing centre on East Timor?
Well, the International Regional Processing Centre should see, we think, the number of arrivals to Australia reduce. Christmas Island is our main detention centre. It's still available for that use. John Howard built it, spent a lot of money building it there. We're using it. Hopefully we won't have to use it much, but that's what it's there for. And it would be very nice to have the problem of what I do with an empty Christmas Island, but I'm not sure that's going to be, a problem for a while.
Now, just finally, Minister, Julia Gillard very effectively yesterday put into context the scale of the border protection problem. As she said in her speech, and this is the quote, "The number of asylum seekers arriving by boat to Australia is very, very minor. It's less than 1.5% of permanent migrants each year." Now, that being the case, why go to the trouble of building an offshore processing centre? Isn't there an inherent contradiction in your policy?
Well, no, people smuggling's illegal. We don't
but
encourage...
it's a small problem as far as Australia is concerned.
It's a small problem in terms of the percentage, and we try and stress that so people don't get fearful, but people are concerned about it. We don't want people arriving unlawfully. Julia acknowledges people are right to say they don't want people arriving unlawfully by boat. We don't want people dying, drowning, coming to Australia, and we've seen many people drown in recent years. We want to try and find a better way, and a better way is saying we'll process people properly in the region, assess their claims. Those that are genuine refugees will be resettled as part of the international response. It's a much more civilised way. It meets our international obligations under the Refugees Convention, and it's much more humane and decent.
Minister, thanks very much for your time.
My pleasure.
The Minister for Immigration, Chris Evans, in our Parliament House studio with our political editor, Alison Carabine.